when Franklin Pierce, through an improbable series of circumstances, became America's 14th president. When the Democratic Convention opened in June 1852 in Baltimore, Pierce was not even a dark horse candidate. He wasn't a horse at all. But when the convention repeatedly deadlocked between Michigan Senator Lewis Cass, former Secretary of State James Buchanan, and Illinois Senator and the mastermind of the Compromise of 1850, Stephen Douglas, Pierce saw his chance. On the convention's 49th ballot, Pierce emerged as the compromise candidate everyone north and south could get behind.
Southern Whigs favored the incumbent president, Millard Fillmore, but Northern Whigs felt the compromise had been a sellout, which they blamed on Fillmore. It took 53 ballots, but finally the Whigs settled on General Winfield Scott, a hero from the Mexican-American War. It was a strategy that had worked for them in the past.
With the opposition party, the Whigs, hopelessly divided between their own northern and southern wings, Pierce easily took the White House. Pierce's goal for his presidency was to do everything he could to keep the Democratic Party united and the country calm. As modest as this sounds, this proved very difficult to achieve. To keep his party united, he appointed Northerners and Southerners to key government posts. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, for example, was his Secretary of War, and Caleb Cushing, a Massachusetts moderate, was his Attorney General.
After the election, but before his inauguration, the Pierce family was in a train accident in which their 11-year-old son died. Benny had been the last of the president's surviving children, and both of his parents moved into the White House exhausted with grief. The president poured his nervous energy into economic and territorial expansion for the nation, noting that it was in America's national security interest to claim more land, and that he would not be restrained by any timid forebodings of evil from expansion. Among his few non-controversial actions was opening diplomatic relations with Japan, hoping that open trade would follow. He also expanded trade with Canada and moved the U.S. closer to acquiring Hawaii. But from the outset, Northerners were suspicious and refused to be distracted from what seemed like his obvious intention to expand slave power. President Pierce used the Monroe Doctrine to force Great Britain out of Central America and promised to use the military to keep them out. He recognized the government of William Walker, an American who had staged a military coup in Nicaragua, though Pierce backpedaled in response to pressure from Cornelius Vanderbilt, an American millionaire who had his own designs for the region.
To keep the country calm, Pierce strongly endorsed the 1850 Compromise. And then one Sunday in January 1854, it all began to unravel. Stephen Douglas showed up at the White House with a new idea he promised would resolve the slavery issue once and for all. It was deceptively simple. Let new territories, future states, determine by popular vote, Douglas called this popular sovereignty, whether they would be slave or free. This principle became the core of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, perhaps the most disastrous piece of legislation in American history. It repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that had banned slavery above latitude 3630, thereby opening up the rest of the Louisiana Territory to slavery. And it shattered the tenuous peace achieved by the 1850 Compromise. Almost immediately, anger, often violent, exploded across Kansas, across Congress, and across the nation as both sides, free and slave, battled to control that state's destiny. From 1854 on, and a glimpse of the conflagration to come, bleeding Kansas was a virtual war zone. Why did Pierce agree to Douglas's plan and help him push it through Congress? One answer is that Douglas was the stronger personality. Pierce simply lacked the fortitude to say no. But there's a second possible answer. Pierce sincerely believed that the Kansas-Nebraska Act would work and reunite the country. It did just the opposite, of course.
Also in 1854, the Ostend Manifesto was leaked. This letter from some of his diplomats revealed to the world that Pierce had attempted to buy Cuba, ostensibly to become a new slave state, and that he should consider military action if Spain refused to sell the land. Pressure from the American public and European leaders led him to abandon this plan. This cartoon reveals how many people felt about the administration's policies. Take a moment to look it over. First, read the title to help you identify the audience and/or the artist's attitude toward the subject. In this case, forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler should help you infer that the attitude of the cartoon is negative towards the figures represented. The president and his supporters hold down a giant free soiler, a person who believed that slavery should not expand into new territory, and push a protesting slave into his throat. Stereotypes and exaggerated images like these generally represent something more complicated in the context in which they were drawn. In this case, a giant represents the anti-slavery residents of Kansas. It's taking the strength of 4 politically powerful men to achieve their goal. What does it mean that they're shoving a slave down his throat? I'd say the artist thinks Americans are opposed to slavery's expansion. Finally, notice that 2 of the men are standing on the Democratic Party platform. This tells us a lot of things. The party as a whole supports what the politicians are doing. The free soiler is tied to it, meaning he's a victim of the Democrats' agenda. And you may not be able to read the small print. The platform says Kansas, Cuba, and Central America. And these were some of the places that Americans thought Pierce was trying to expand slavery. There's some other inflammatory details in the background, depicting the violence in Kansas, which served to reinforce the main idea.
He couldn't even win his party's nomination in 1856.